Um, in 2005, Susan Morris named a series of screen prints based on year planners that she spoke about. She named them I am ... bracket still, end of bracket. And so in a way her title obviously invoked On Kawara's I am still alive telegrams, and the resonances, I think, are very vivid here with On Kawara's work and with, in the context of today's concerns with time and the body. And when I saw the recent On Kawara show at the, these are Susan's working in the process of making her year planner works. When I saw that recent On Kawara show at the Guggenheim, sadly never to travel, it brought Susan's work to my mind. So today I'd like to just reflect on Kawara's today paintings in this context, not because Susan's work does the same as On Kawara or looks anything like On Kawara's, but because I think it does touch on some similar questions, particularly of what I'll go on later to try to talk about as life work. So these are the works by Susan, the works that in a way came to my mind looking at the Guggenheim show, but just as much I guess I'd like to invoke the tapestries that she has been talking about. Okay. There were days when On Kawara made no paintings, not one, and days, very few, when he made two, or even, I think once, three. On almost 3,000 other days since 1966 until his death last year, as you know, he made a painting that contained the date of the day that it was made. Different colours, though few, different size canvases, often slight, as we can see from this installation shot of that recent Guggenheim show. But each is a painting that marked and recorded a day, marking and recording it as it was lived and being made, and then as soon as it was over, marking and recording a day that was past. So the temporal split of its presence in the present tense and subsequent removal or transition to time past is there in every single date painting. And the splits, and I've only named one of them, just carry on splitting. Others attach to it, attend upon it, fall thick and fast upon the work. Marking time, as Maggie has shown in her discussion of Susan's work, is always a matter of these kind of multiple temporalities and indeterminacies. On Kawara was clear and strict about his procedure that each and every painting had to be painted on the day that contained it, the day marked by the date it contained. If he hadn't finished it, he destroyed it. It was hand-painted on its monochrome ground, a procedure that obviously for On Kawara importantly replaced pictorial composition and the kinds of aesthetic choices attached to pictorial composition. So dates measure time, for sure, and like other ways of measuring, they abbreviate. Not weights and measures now, but months, days, years. Dates, like the ones On Kawara paints meticulously onto each of his monochromes, is a contradiction. I'll return to that. Is a contraction. I'll return to that idea, but let me emphasize straight away that dates are also a way of encoding information like other systems, other kinds of data, other systemic forms of data, other networks that we live with and inside, alphabetical systems, numerical systems, grammatical systems, and which of course became such ubiquitous material for conceptual artists. So a date is one way of encoding a day, of ordering calendrical time, and totally conventional. It's linguistically and culturally embedded. And On Kawara takes the habitual and makes it strange. There's a friction that On Kawara set in train between inscription and encryption. Does that make sense? Encryption. Encryption. Words written on a surface that can encode information which is culturally shared, and information or data that's encrypted, to which we may or may not have the key. For instance, there are the drawings like this code drawing and the code paintings that On Kawara destroyed. And he destroyed them because why? They failed, they fell short in the way, in some way. Well, On Kawara was notoriously private. That kind of information is edited out, isn't it, by destroying them? In a way, encrypted. And as much as its storage, maybe that almost entropic dissolution of data, On Kawara's own, the nemesis, of art history, is one of the most vital legacies of On Kawara's particular type of conceptualism. So he destroyed these code paintings from the mid-60s, but there are these drawings that are characterized by very small strokes of colored crayon which slant forward in what look like word groups, with the punctuation visible and interspersed between them, and their question marks and their inverted commas and so on there. And these groups of small strokes run across the page like writing or Morse or Braille, but they're completely, obviously, indecipherable. The love letter, the encoded love letter, like this one, because that is what is encoded, a love letter, was based, On Kawara apparently admitted, on a model love letter from a writing manual. So, what could be more private, more intimate than a love letter, yet more impersonal and conventionalized as an exemplar of the genre, yet then turned into its own private language. The idea of a love letter plays tricks. A love letter plays tricks, and it plays with your head maybe as well. He also published, this is further to that, he also published, invisible to you. He also published an edition in 1995, part of which consisted of a Braille version of a poem by the French poet Jacques Roubaud. And the poem is Roubaud's Six Sens, from Six Codes du Temps, 6 codes of time. And Jacques Roubaud was involved in Paris, had been involved in Paris from the start with the Oulipo group. Oulipo was the workshop of potential literature that had been founded in 1966, and the most famous members of Oulipo, I'm sure you've heard of, were Raymond Queneau and, of course, Georges Perec, whose life, the user's manual and species of spaces have become much more famous than Oulipo itself. Now, Roubaud was a poet and professor of mathematics, a lover of numbers, a lover of sonnets, both in excess, who published his thesis in the mid-60s on set theory, around the same time that he published his first book of poetry. And he was interested, Jacques Roubaud this is, in troubadour poetry in particular, in Japanese poetry in particular, and Wittgenstein in particular, all of which makes him resonate with On Kawara. And he was fascinated also by On Kawara, knew On Kawara, and collaborated with him, as we've seen, even though Roubaud remembers that On Kawara spoke no French. In fact, On Kawara did speak some French, but clearly little. And in a way, I kind of feel that Roubaud's insistence that he didn't speak any French merely emphasizes what interested both of them, which was the opacity of language. So On Kawara was encrypting in Braille something as already so encrypted in its own abstract system as a poem by Jacques Roubaud, whose poems were diagrammed in accordance with larger matrices and connections. And poetry was for Roubaud, as I think it was for On Kawara, a form of life, with a mode d'emploi, as for Perec, a set of instructions. And the more such instructions or rules are put in place, the more lost you get. So either only using the vowel E, that's Jacques Roubaud, or never using the vowel E. Perec famously wrote La disparition without ever using the vowel E, makes for these vertiginous and absurd concoctions of language, really, that can become hopelessly, and sometimes did, esoteric, or at their best almost reckless in their absurd pursuit of such arbitrary rules and abstract systems. And surely this is the crux of On Kawara's project, and the crux of what I'd like to bring to the table here is that On Kawara's project is so totally esoteric in some ways, turned in or involuted on itself, and yet rather than turn its back on the world, these paintings surely only face outwards. They are only declarative. They only assert themselves. They seem to put in question precisely how we think of what's inside and what is outside a painting, or what's inside and outside art. A painting that's both a nodal point in a wildly abstract system and a red, a black or a blue thing, a physical entity that attaches to the wall, which of course had to be a painting for On Kawara, but also doesn't have to be a painting and could even be a tapestry. Of various sizes then, but normally small, occasionally big. This one, February 27th, 1987, is not quite the largest, but almost. The three On Kawara made in July 1969 during the moon landings are the largest size he made. Yet this one was a date of no consequence whatsoever, or if it was, we cannot know why or what that was, making even more uncertain and arbitrary those kinds of question of scale. All that is in the painting is a date, and yet that's absolutely not all that a today painting is. It's a made thing on canvas, simple yet cryptic, as we've seen. And the paintings may be part of a larger system, yet they also behave in ways that belie its abstraction. Colour and size together totally compound everything. even though they are also the most simple and declarative things about these paintings. So the method is complicated, but the effects and consequences are. For instance, it's hard to say whether colour is encoded here, or whether, on the contrary, colour escapes the very system that On Kawara set in train. It seems that On Kawara can be erratic. Colour is erratic. There were days when he painted the ground cadmium red or blue, and many of the first ones were blue, like this one from January 1966, one of the very first, that mark, so the ones that are, say, cadmium red or blue often mark an interruption or a disruption in the sequence of what is overwhelmingly dark grey. This studio photo from 1966, which was probably taken by On Kawara himself, in which he included this photograph in the files that he made archiving the work, seems on the one hand to show the inward turn of the work, what could be more so than the artist's studio, so rarely photographed in On Kawara's case, turned in on itself. Yet of course the paintings are on display on the studio walls, and the few photographs of his workspaces show how elastic the sequencing of the paintings could be, and certainly the way they're shown here demonstrate the variable ways in which that they can be grouped. And this was so in the Guggenheim exhibition as well, because On Kawara himself devised groups for various exhibitions, a group of Sundays, for example, or one from each of 48 years, so one series of 48, so there were series within the series. So this is a work, On Kawara's work, I mean, is work made of fractured parts that consists of interruption, that is interruption. It's an archive without memories, only colours, digits, letters, punctuation, all of them sparse. And the work doesn't keep in step with any kind of sequential ordering, but feels fractured, scrambled, as time does. And yet they also, I think, resist the abstraction of time as it's measured by date. The fact of them as paintings is different, feels different. It's work that arguably empties out its interior to become all surface and entirely subject to the outside of painting, contained only by the date it was painted and the colour selected. And of course what the discussion of time as an abstraction misses is the material character of a date as a kind of word, code or thing. And the dates are abbreviated according to convention, but also according to the convention of whatever country On Kawara was when he painted them. So entirely contingent on the date it was painted and his whereabouts in the world when he painted it. So month, day, year, month, day, year, as in the US, or day, month, year, as in Europe, or in countries, his home country like Japan, which doesn't use the Roman alphabet, he would use the utopian language of Esperanto. But of course these adjustments occur on the surface of painting, beneath which there's an underlayer. And we can see it in the boxes On Kawara made, but which he didn't see as the work, or at least not as the work to be exhibited. More like a kind of sub-object to the object that's the painting. A section of a page from a newspaper, again of course local to the place he was in, and the day it was painted on, inserts the work in the context of mass media circulation, but also, I guess, extracts it from it. And often the kind of event is, despite the word apocalypse that you can see here, despite the word apocalypse, a small disaster usually, not always, but often a small disaster, one that's below the radar of history. The infra-ordinary, the infra-ordinaire, as Perec and Rubin would use that term, rather than extraordinary. Perec said it first, coined that term, the infra-ordinaire. The infra-ordinary, Perec said, was background noise, the habitual, as opposed to, I quote Perec, the big event, the front page splash. And I think there's something at stake in this adjustment of Duchamp's idea of the inframas, the infra-thing, to what Perec dubbed the infra-ordinaire, the infra-ordinary, and which the Oulipo group liked to call upon. Their idea of the mot valise, a suitcase full of words, which again was a kind of adjustment of a Duchampian box or suitcase. And for On Kawara, with his boxes that contained words too, this adjustment seemed to offer him the possibility to continue to make paintings in a way, but paintings that also fell below the radar of the big event, let alone the splash that a painting might have conventionally been taken as. And I don't mean the historical event, and nor do I mean history painting, as you may know Jeff Wall has made a powerful case for On Kawara in relation to history painting. I don't mean that. I mean that sense of belonging beneath the threshold or beneath the radar of history, beneath the work of history, but more to do with the work of the artwork. And so the smallest details are important, the tiny details of punctuation, a comma, full stop, attending to the smallness in an On Kawara painting can overwhelm us with the vastness of the undertaking, like life. And the vastness of the undertaking is always freighted with that impossibility. In the case of On Kawara's work, the impossibility of ever showing all the work together. After all, what could be more, or rather what I wanted to say is I don't want to think so much about what it was to be On Kawara, and what it meant for On Kawara to do this even, but more what it means for us to confront On Kawara's work now. What the work might feel like now. After all, what could be more hermetic, yet what could be more open to the whole world? And I've suggested the work is encrypted in the work, but it's also declarative in its simple monochrome quality. Declarative then of a split between world and work, but one which is impossible or certainly difficult to hold in place in the work. So one nagging aspect of this is the question of singularity. After all, nothing is more singular than a single day, yet the work is serial and would seem to defy the singularity of the artwork. So perhaps that's what singularity ends up meaning. It means simply an interruption of some kind. There's something in the effect of On Kawara's work, I don't know, something kind of the wrong way round, or intuitively the wrong way round, rather than what the work is made out of. The newspaper is relegated to being this kind of underlayer, a lining, literally, a part that is apart, severed from painting. All this is part of the work that On Kawara does after he's made the painting. The work of ordering, the laborious procedure of archiving, of diary making, as in the colour diary that's also part of the post-production of the work. I'll come back to it later. As if the colour choices are working in reverse, where the process of making the work is recorded post facto. So it's the work of an archivist, but as I said, it's an archive without memory, an artist locked into his routines, an archivist of his own life, the archiving of which also seems to fill his life. I don't think On Kawara is necessarily presenting a kind of Proustian world of memory impressions, and yet I think there is certainly a sense of a kind of mnemonic diagram perhaps that underlies this work, and in particular there is a very Proustian sense, or a powerful idea that one might associate it with Proust's project, which is that making a work is making one vast work. You know, that all the work constitutes one vast work. Not just a life's work, but a kind of life work. And within the work, there's always this logic to bury itself in its own system, not to show it almost, rather than show it. To keep a significant part of the work under wraps inside the box. So although On Kawara actually in the end did agree at the Guggenheim for the boxes in the newspapers to be shown, strictly speaking, they were not the work. And he always kept those distinctions in place. And I said at the start that I wanted to think about the work of the work as it's presented in the world, not as a means to think about On Kawara, the artist, necessarily, but the logic of the work as it expands exponentially outward to the vertiginous numbers which plunge us into an abyss of overwhelming data or into deep time. That is there for sure, but it's also countered by this massive contraction that takes us simply to the letters, the digits, the dates. And of course the letters and the digits of the dates are themselves bit parts, they're themselves bits of words. They're merely small parts within this vast, disjointed whole. The simple composite parts that create this alarmingly elastic time scale that expands and also contracts. And so I think it's important to enumerate them once again, at the very least to simply enumerate the material parts of the today paintings. The painting itself, made up of one part monochrome, one part the date, written always in white. The page from a newspaper that I've shown you, not the main work. The cardboard box as here, not to be exhibited as the work. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the book or diary of colour swatches. Each small colour swatch taken from a sample of paint, brushed over a cut-out template, which is then also dated and archived in another file. Okay? So this is a file that archives the previous file, etc., etc. And this goes on. There are more elements to this. And the fact that these last elements are not to be shown as the work doesn't mean that they're not part of the work, but that the work itself is necessarily divided into parts, or rather, I guess what I'm trying to say is simply that On Kawara's work puts pressure on what work consists of, what can constitute the work, how we describe it. So, what I'm also trying to say is if the date belongs to the painting, then by contrast it's clear as day that the painting does not belong to the day it was painted. And doesn't it follow that therefore the work is always going to be incomplete as a consequence? So yes, the project was curtailed on Kawara's death, but the work of course doesn't end there. The more you immerse yourself in On Kawara's work and the more you try to figure it out, the more lost you get. It does feel like a kind of Borges labyrinth. And I don't think there's any point denying this extreme hermeticism, but the paradox is, one of the paradoxes is that all that occlusion, encryption, opacity, On Kawara's work lays bare the work that art does. You know, all that encryption, and yet it lays bare the process as a set of speculative tools or devices. And rather than entombing art, as you might expect it to, it's as if a date painting is not in the end a memorial or some kind of tombstone to a day. On Kawara's work seems to me to do the reverse, to make painting possible, to make work possible, in his case to make paintings possible. So all those rules he sets himself, all the constraints make art possible to make. I guess what I've tried to describe is the way in which what at first seems quite simple, but in fact is an elaborate set of instructions to himself. They can seem clear, but then they very quickly collapse into uncertainty. All the coordinates dissipate as you go along. Is this the idea then of process that On Kawara delivers to us? If so, it's process radically reversed, moving backwards as a very particular form of life. So there were days when On Kawara made a painting, took a colour swatch, archived the painting, archived the colour, sent a postcard, 2 postcards, sent a telegram, etc., etc. Each day he filled his days like this. And with the date paintings, he thought they were the work, not the box, the newspaper, but can we be so sure? But more to the point, why would we want to police that border when it seems that what On Kawara did was to break down precisely that sense of where the inside of the work ended and the outside began? There were, I think I'm right in saying, no days when Susan Morris, over that 5-year period, did not wear the watch. I might be wrong there, but I think there were no days when she didn't wear the watch that monitored her activity and collected data of a life as it was lived, as we've heard. And there were days when there was little activity and days when there was a great deal of activity. Days when she was in a different time zone, when a few days veer off the pattern of night and day encoded in one of her tapestries, as we can see. Vast amounts of data codified, abstracted, and then woven, made material, which makes them, at the very least, very visible contradictions, much like On Kawara's. Thank you.
I think we have 5 minutes for a couple of questions. We'll have a couple of questions for each individual paper, and then all 5 speakers squeeze together at the end for a discussion. But does anybody have anything they'd like to ask or points to raise at this stage?
I have a question, Rich. It's sort of a question for Ed as well, which is that you use that word contraction, as though these things sort of compress, events, whatever, into this bare date. And that's part of its power, that contraction. I say it relates to Ed because I know he's working on similar ideas. But I have to admit that just as you were saying, it has nothing to do with a memorial or something. I was thinking, oh, like a memorial. So you're sort of shifting, I feel, the interest of the work away from that notion of kind of making the day mean something, even if it's just.
When you talk about On Kawara's work with others, I sometimes find myself in sync and sometimes very out of sync. I was having a conversation with somebody who was remembering the dead. I was just so alien to the way in which I experienced this work. I can never remember the day. Or that horrible thing where people have an On Kawara painting that for their birthday. It's like there's a total betrayal of On Kawara. I'm sure they were never worth anything, were they, until now they are. But I guess I was interested in the idea of contraction through the simple, both very cultural abbreviation, where September the 6th, 1992, which itself is a way of encoding information, is then broken down into parts, like literally the abbreviated notation here. And so that idea that it's, bits next to bits, and that language, the date is actually a series of bits, and so that becomes like Beckett at one point has this wonderful phrase about tal quat, that the work is complete with missing parts, that idea. I think that's really, and although people often, of course, and it is overwhelming, the vastness of the data that in a way On Kawara's work is assimilating into itself, which of course is different from now, but not so different. It seemed vast, obviously, the kind of data that is assimilating to the artwork. I think there's also this double action, which is also this contraction into a single painting. So actually, you can see a single painting by On Kawara. It's not the same as seeing them spiraling around the Guggenheim, but they have a different kind of work to do. And that's also part of them. And I guess it's on that surface where this porosity between inside and outside is most evidently felt, I guess. Yeah, did you? Okay.
Maybe not this time. We've only got a minute, so maybe there's anything else or. I don't know which one came up first.
Do you want to speak? Was it?
Sure. Hi, thanks for that. I was just wanted to ask about your sort of tour up the spiral and this kind of idea of how horrified you were by the idea of, someone owning On Kawara from their birthday. That if, as you were touring, you actually came across a date that was significant to you, and kind of how this tension of this sort of like overwhelming kind of index of numbers that you could imagine extending beyond their creation, and in this kind of like, I suppose, absence of intimate information at the same time as total information would then collide with something that felt personally significant.
In this particular exhibition, obviously it was a retrospective of all On Kawara's work except for the bathroom drawings and the work before he came to New York. So the accumulations of systems and numbers, including the million years and the lists of people and so on. So the kind of accumulation of dates and numbers, I think, has the effect of emptying out those normal correlates. And even if one identifies a date, even if I had come across some date that is meaningful for me, I think which actually we did come across the date of the birthday of the person I was with, which seemed to excite them quite a lot. Some kind of cosmic meeting that their birthday should be in and not mine. But I think there's something weirdly, it's about, if you attach to that or kind of connect with it, the disconnect is also just as powerful, because it's of course entirely kind of meaningless and arbitrary. And I think the sense that would be interesting is the feeling that can be quite euphoric of coincidence, but that's the point of the work. The coincidences are really, they're happening between the works, but they're completely arbitrary, which means that aside from those three, which are huge, these really big, I've forgotten the measurements exactly, but are the 3 days when he's transfixed by the moon landings, they really don't equate with anything significant. They throw you. So the sense of, what is significant to us in our lives, the arbitrariness of that, it does have a real poignancy, I think, but I don't think it's one that's personal or takes the kind of conventional form of our own autobiography, let alone knowing about On Kawara's, who of course, did as much as an artist or anybody could possibly do to erase that from our being able to know it, which is also a wonderful thing, I think.
That might be a good note for us to finish. Thanks very much, Brian.